Hi, how are you all? My name's Clare, I'm part of the team here, and we are just coming to the end of a little series on hearing the voice of God. So, let's start with a couple of questions. How is that going for you? Are you somebody who feels like you hear the voice of God easily? Yeah, stick your hand up okay, we've got a few confident hearers in the room. Okay. Up then if you think it is important that somebody put their hand up before I even said something then who's keen. If you think it is part of being a follower of Jesus to be able to hear God. Yeah, so we're on that page. Who thinks it's easy? Some people do. Okay. It's a bit of a thing that some people feel like they've probably grown in it. Yeah? I think, Steve Ballard, even you have grown in hearing God's voice. Yeah? And it is something that maybe we need to practice. So that's why we've had this series on the voice. And we've looked at different things like recognizing that God rarely shouts at us. I don't know if he ever has. I don't even know of anybody who's ever heard of God shouting at them. But more often, it's more subtle, isn't it? It's kind of the still, small voice. And we've looked at things like the fact that sometimes when we're trying to hear God's voice, our own voice inwardly, our sort of emotions, the things that we really want to happen, are very loud and noisy, and it's a bit hard to hear God through that. Last week, we looked at the challenging voice of God. You know, are we able to hear God challenge us? And, you know, we were encouraged not to harden our hearts when we hear God challenging us. And we're just going to finish off this today with looking at what we're calling the shepherd's voice. So does God sound like a shepherd to you? Now, my son and daughter-in-law are in the room today, and her parents are both here. Now, my daughter-in-law's dad has got a flock of sheep. So he's a shepherd. And I'm going to say some things about being a shepherd today, so I hope I don't get anything wrong, but welcome you guys. Lovely to have you here. So what does God's voice sound like? Does it sound like a shepherd to you? The other night I was watching Louis Theroux's documentary on Westboro Baptist Church. Has anyone seen that? So it is a documentary about a very well-known church in America that has become known for really the angry voice of God. And some of the people from that church, they picket outside various events and they shout at people that God is angry with you and that he hates your sin and that you're going to hell. And it is very hard to hear. And Louis Theroux, who does the documentary, he's baffled by it. He obviously doesn't believe in God at all, and he can't understand why anyone would want to be part of such a thing. And it is a bit confusing hearing that voice. And I think, if we're really honest, it is a bit of contested ground even within us. God's voice. Do we get the tone of his voice right? So when he speaks to you, how does he speak and in what sort of tone? And I think, if I'm honest, sometimes meeting up with people and talking with them and praying with them, it does seem evident to me that a lot of people do feel that God is often a bit irritated, a bit stern, a bit harsh, critical even. And sometimes we feel a bit like, well, God must be annoyed with me because I haven't got it yet. And he's slightly clicking his fingers saying, come on, hurry up, grow up, there's things to be done. And I think sometimes some people do carry that sense of God's voice being like that. For others, the voice of God is a bit more like, anything's fine, you're great. You know, mercy. And, we love to flick through the Bible and find the comforting passages in the Bible that will make us feel comforted. And we avoid certain passages maybe because they don't sound like the kind of God that we want to relate to. So we're picking our way through slightly contested ground, I think we'd agree, okay? So we're just going to have a look now at a very well-known passage where Jesus talks about the shepherd who is leading his sheep. Now, the shepherd was a familiar theme. You know, the Jewish people, that some of their greats were shepherds. Moses And King David was a shepherd. There was lots of shepherds, Prophet Amos, lots of them. And it's a familiar theme to picture God as a shepherd. So loads of us are familiar with Psalm 23, yeah? The shepherd's psalm. So it's a familiar idea, and Jesus picks up on it. He'd already spoken about himself in a parable being like the shepherd who seeks the lost sheep. And here he is. He's putting himself right in the center of this little story. The context of it is that what has happened just before is Jesus is in a bit of a barney, a bit of an argument with the Pharisees, who often pop up like the baddies, don't they? And I don't know if they were baddies, really. I think they were just argumentative. And they're troubled by Jesus. Jesus has just healed a blind man. And in the discourse that happens after that, they feel that Jesus is kind of saying to them, "You're blind." And they say to him, "So, do you think we're blind?" These are the guides of Israel. They believed that they were there to lead the people to God and through life. And Jesus is saying, "You're blind." And then he goes on to speak about this shepherd who will lead the people of Israel without blindness, but with somebody who sees. So this is the context of this passage. It's in John chapter 8, and we're going to read it. So, very truly I tell you, Pharisees, so the Pharisees, if you're not familiar with those guys, those are the ones I'm talking about. They're the religious leaders, and they're very religious. Anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. "I am the good shepherd," said Jesus. "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. He cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." So Jesus really emphasizing these points, this little story about a shepherd with his flock. And it's not a kind of nice little fairy tale story, really, is it? The story is full of tension. There's the people trying to force their way into the flock and trying to get in through the door, and Jesus says, "But I'm the door, and you can't come in through any other way." And then there's these hired hands, the servants, who are paid just to look after the sheep, but when trouble comes, when the wolf comes, they just disappear because they don't really care about the sheep. And then Jesus says, "But I am the shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep." So that's the contested ground, if you like, of being somebody who is a follower of the shepherd. It's in the context of a bit of a struggle for leadership, struggle for guidance, struggle for hearing the right voices. So, and that we need to ask the question sometimes, are the voices that I'm listening to the voice of the shepherd? So that's where we're going. And what exactly does that sound like? So the first thing is that the voice of the shepherd sounds like sacrificial love. Jesus said, "I lay down my life for the sheep." And he's saying it to these Pharisees, these religious leaders, who he obviously is implying are trying to lead the sheep, but through the wrong means, forcing their way and being strident, forcing their way into that leadership position. Or maybe they're the hired hands who just disappear when trouble comes. And Jesus says, when you know the shepherd, you know that he has sacrificed his life for you. It's going to sound like sacrificial love. So does it sound like that in your head when you hear God speaking? What does that sound like? And I think, honestly, The ground we're talking about, what's going on internally for us, for many of us, is in our brokenness, in our woundedness, in the experiences of life that we've had, maybe even our own leaders, our fathers and mothers, the people who have led us in life. Perhaps in those broken ways that they have spoken to us and we have, in our woundedness, we hear more easily the voice of harshness and control. It's more natural to us to think that God is like that because we're broken people and we can distort the voice of God and we home in on the voice of harshness, which is why it is so common, I think, that we feel that God is that irritated, stern, critical God. And we must question that. If that's the habitual voice of God that we feel God is most often like when we're listening to him, then we must question it. Because Jesus here is saying that there are voices trying to lead the sheep who are harsh and religious and forcing, and God is not that kind of God. But there's also, like I was saying, the other kind of voices that sort of say, disappear when the going gets tough. That's what he's saying there. And it reminded me a little bit of Jeremiah being in the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. God is rebuking some of the leaders of the people. He's saying to the kings and priests, you're healing the wound of my people lightly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. And God is not up for that either. He's neither saying there's nothing wrong and everything's fine. I'm just a blessing God. That's not it either. And sometimes we home in on those things. Like I say, we look for the Bible verses that give us, just reinforce where we're at so we don't have to change. And if we're honest, many of us are resistant to change. We don't really want to walk according to another voice. We want to walk according to the voices that are most comfortable for us. And neither is that the way, says Jesus. There's another way between these two extremes where there's a shepherd who walks in front of us with sacrificial love. And his voice sounds like love. He loves you. He would go to the ends of the earth for you. And he has done. He sent his son to die for you, to lay down his life for you. And when you listen to him, you must look out for the one who has that tone of voice, just like that. And the other thing is that God's voice is liberating. It brings us into freedom and things that, when you hear the voice of God and you feel heavy and condemned and bound up by it, it's not the voice of God. We have an enemy, the Bible tells us, that seeks to lie to us and trap us into places where we're bound up. And Jesus leads us with a voice that is about liberation and freedom. And that's kind of the hallmark of listening to the voice of God, is that you will find yourself more free, progressively more free, the more you listen to him and are led by him. That's also why we're not talking about prophecy today in the sense of giving out prophetic words, but this is the foundation for prophecy, being able to hear God's voice accurately for ourselves. And that's why when we give out a prophetic word, we're not into giving harsh, condemning, critical ones, because we're following a God of freedom and sacrificial love. And so we're looking for prophecy that builds up and strengthens and encourages. That's New Testament prophecy. So, sacrificial love, the voice of God. It's freeing and it's liberating. Secondly, the voice of God sounds like someone who knows you and whom you are growing to know. So we're known by God and we're growing in knowing God. And actually, psychologists say that it's a core human need to be known. You need to be known. Every one of us needs to be known and accepted. And that when we are known and accepted, we can live a life that is fruitful and that we can start to relax and be truly us. And that is one of the greatest facts in the universe, is that God knows you. He knows where you've been. He knows what you've done. He knows how you think. It's uncomfortable sometimes to know that, isn't it? But the reality is that God is never going to discover something about you that will make him draw away or turn away from you in disgust or disappointment, because he already knows everything. And he says to you, you're accepted by me. I love you unconditionally. You're under my mercy and grace. He knows you. How can you grow in being known by God? Is it something that is just, you just have to accept, or can you actually grow in it? Well, a few months ago, some of us met a monk from France. He lives in a community called Thésée. And this community, they sort of welcome lots of people to come every year to experience silence and contemplation and worship in a beautiful setting. But this monk, lots of us spent some time with him, and he was just a beautiful person, really at peace, really wise and strong, and you felt like he had this sort of connection to God that he'd cultivated over years and years. And we had one time when we were talking about prayer, and he was saying people get so stressed out about prayer, they find it so hard. It's almost like, but he said, I feel like it's a bit like eating a meal, prayer is. You don't sort of say to yourself beforehand, I don't know how I'm going to eat this meal, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. You just get on and eat it. And he had such a simple, refreshing view about prayer. And one of the things he said that really stuck with me, he said, sometimes in prayer, what I do is I just let God look at me for a long time. And I ask him, just look at me. One of the psalmists says, look at me. And Psalm 139 at the end says, search me, O God, know my heart, look at me. Look at me. Do you ever do that? What a thing to do. Why not do it this week? Why not give yourself half an hour at some point this week, make an appointment with God and say, I'm not going to say too much, God, I'm just going to let you look at me. It's a different sort of orientation in prayer, and you might find something else comes out of it. There's nothing that you need to achieve in it, just let God look at you. He knows you, and he wants you to grow in the knowledge of being known by God. And out of that comes your knowledge of God. The more that you are in that intimate relationship with him, you will grow to know him. And that is absolutely what Jesus was saying in this parable. He's saying, this is what the sheep are experiencing. I know them. I know their names, but also they know me, so they follow my voice. And that's what happened with shepherds. They lived day and night with their sheep. And the sheep responded to the sound of the shepherd's voice and not other voices. The sheep would be their healer. The shepherd would be their healer, the one that would feel for the ticks in their fur and pull them out and heal their wounds, bind up broken limbs, find new pasture, fight off the wolves. Jesus is saying, I'm like that. Can you see me like that? Can you grow in that? So intimacy is absolutely the order of the day. And so alien to these Pharisees' ears, I think, is the idea that you and I could be that intimate with God and know him that well. And finally, Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, they listen to me, and they follow. Now, I think that it's a common thing in my life, and I'm sure it is in yours as well, that I'm kind of listening to hear what God is saying, but so that I can weigh it up and work out whether or not I'm going to follow. Do you see what I mean? It's kind of like, well, what are you saying? What are the options here? Show me what's on the table, God. And if I can, then maybe I'll follow. And, Jesus kind of rules out that as a way of listening to God. So do you do that? Are you listening for his voice and kind of keeping, on Facebook, you can have you're going to an event or not going to an event. And then there's the maybe section. I think we're the maybe culture. You're like, what are you saying to us at the moment? I might go there. But Jesus is ruling that out. He says that if you're a sheep with a shepherd, they listen to the voice of the shepherd and they follow. And those two things go together. And if we want to grow in knowing the voice of God and being able to follow him and hear him, we're going to have an orientation that starts with yes to God. That's what we've got to do when we hear his challenging voice as well. Before the challenge comes, there's going to be a yes internally in me that says, whatever you say to me, God, I want to follow. When I hear you, I am coming. I'm going to follow. And that is, that is contested ground in us as well, if we're really honest. And for many of us, we're still in that kind of maybe section. But Jesus is inviting us, if we want to know his voice increasingly, following will be part of it. And it'll be getting up and moving. And sheep, they need fresh pasture, don't they? We do. Do you need fresh pasture at the moment? Many of us feel a bit dry, a bit dusty, a bit like parched, and we long for the Psalm 23 of the green pastures and the lovely water to lie by. But, finding fresh pasture, those shepherds, they weren't in the lowlands where it was all lovely and grassy. They were in the mountains. It was a rugged job being a shepherd, having sheep. And sometimes finding new pasture means going on a little journey. And it's rough terrain sometimes. And for some of you today, that is where you're at. You're in the in-between pastures. One pasture is dried up, and there's another one that you need, and the terrain is a little rough. Can you follow the shepherd and learn to hear his voice? I was brought up by a mum who absolutely made it normal that living the Christian life is to be spoken to by God. Not in a booming voice, but daily, in a normal, intimate way. And I just want to encourage you, really, that that's available to all of us. And actually, Jesus calls us to be those people, the flock who are led by the voice of Jesus. He calls us to be that. And the world needs to see what it looks like to have a group of people, a community of people who are being led by the one that loves them sacrificially. Somehow we're meant to reflect what it's like to be led by the intimate voice of God. And I just want to encourage us all to come back to that place as I come to an end. I'm going to pray for us that, first of all, that we would be able to hear the shepherd's voice, but also that we would rise to the challenge of being a follower, someone who listens out and dares to follow, even if the terrain gets a bit rocky. Trust the shepherd because he knows you. He knows what you can and you can't do. He knows more than you. And he's laid down his life for you. That is who he is, the shepherd who lays down his life for the flock. So, Father God, we pray today that we would be those people who can hear your voice. It's one thing to listen to a sermon series on hearing your voice, God, but it is quite another to follow, to be able to hear well. I pray that in our woundedness, in our brokenness, where we have distorted your voice, I pray that your spirit of truth would come and straighten those bent out of shape places, our radar that are looking for condemnation. Help us, God, to see past that to your mercy and grace. Help us to rise to the challenge of being led by the shepherd. In Jesus' name, amen.